Medications like Ozempic and Wegovy are very popular treatments for type 2 diabetes and for weight loss. But according to this publication, people taking these medications have a dramatically lower risk of multiple sclerosis. Is this for real? Let's take a look at the data. So this study is based on FAERS, the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System. You may have heard of FAERS to report vaccine side effects. Well, you can report adverse events from any drug, and anyone can report them. I can report them if I'm the prescriber, but people who have the side effects can report them themselves, and they look between 2003 and 2023, so 20 years, and it's completely voluntary reporting, but of course people are busy. Sometimes they put in a brief or incomplete report, and multiple people could report the same thing in the same person, so there can be duplicates, so it's considered to be not very accurate, and of course there's no control group, and it's voluntary who reports. So what is the real denominator? How many people really got the drug and had this event? We don't know for certain. So just to be clear, this is a weak methodology. It's very, very preliminary, and it can be highly biased. And this is what the FAERS dashboard looks like. Just to give you a sense of it, you can check for yourself. These are all the cases of multiple sclerosis reported between 2015 and 2024 to FAERS, and there aren't a lot in 2024 because there's a delay. People have to review the cases before they get into the database, and roughly speaking, around 3,000 to 3,500 cases are reported per year, which is much lower than the total incidence of new diagnoses of MS in the United States, because not all cases are reported. It's just a fraction of them. Now, what would weight loss drugs have to do with multiple sclerosis? That sounds completely random. Well, there may be some association between obesity and MS. For instance, this study from Germany looked at children with MS, and they found that obese children had roughly double the risk of MS. For girls, the odds ratio, the risk of MS relative to those who are not obese, was 2.19, a little more than double the risk. And for boys, it was an odds ratio of 2.14, and both of these were highly statistically significant, p-value less than 0.001 and 0.003. Also, those who were obese had a slightly worse prognosis. Those receiving first-line treatment, this is a little bit of an antiquated term. Here they're referring to the drugs glatiramer acetate, Copaxone, Glatopa, and beta-interferons, drugs such as Betaseron, Rebif, Xtavia, Avidex, Plegridy. Now, of course, we use stronger drugs first line all the time, but those children receiving those drugs who were obese had a 29% greater risk of relapsing despite treatment, and this was also statistically significant. This is a different German study looking at prognosis in multiple sclerosis, not a pediatric study, and they looked at people who were obese, the red line, versus the blue line, people who were not obese, and they looked at the proportion who got to EDSS-3. So EDSS, or Expanded Disability Status Scale, is a measure of disability in multiple sclerosis research, and 3 would be a relatively low amount of disability, perhaps moderate disability, and so these are people who have not reached EDSS-3, in other words, are doing very well, and you can see people who are not obese, the blue line, after 6 years, about 85% still had not reached EDSS-3, versus people who are obese, it was a little under 70%, a significant difference after only 6 years. Of course, I could not leave off a study where I'm one of the authors. This is our data from Southern California, a bit of a dated study, 2013, but still relevant. We did not find any association in weight or obesity with risk of MS in boys, but in girls, the risk of pediatric MS seemed to have some kind of dose-dependent association. For girls who were overweight or with moderate obesity, there was a non-statistically significant trend towards greater risk of MS. You can see the confidence intervals do overlap one, but in extreme obesity, there was nearly a 4-fold increased risk, which was statistically significant. Also, there's a recent study in Sweden, again suggesting an association of obesity with pediatric MS. By the way, my name is Brandon Beaber. I make videos about MS every Wednesday. So what are these drugs I'm talking about? Well, one very famous class of drugs is the GLP-1 agonists, drugs such as Ozempic and Victoza, and these are drugs that stimulate the glucagon-like peptide 1 that's stimulated in different areas of the body. It does a lot of different things. It works in the pancreas to increase the release of insulin in response to glucose. It slows the emptying of the stomach and slows movement through the gastrointestinal tract, and also works on the brain to suppress appetite, and the net effect is weight loss and lower blood glucose levels, improving diabetes. Another class of drugs we're going to see is the SGL2 inhibitors. These are drugs like Jardiance and Invokana, very well advertised drugs. They block the sodium glucose cotransporter 2 in the kidney, blocking the reabsorption of glucose or sugar in the kidney, so you dump it out in the urine, and of course you're dumping out calories, so you lose weight, and it lowers your blood sugar, but it doesn't really suppress appetite. There are a lot of theories as to why obesity and these drugs may be connected with MS. One idea is that excessive fat tissue may be bad in general. It may be pro-inflammatory. There's evidence that it can release certain inflammatory cytokines. These are proteins that stimulate the immune system, such as tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 6, and excessive fat may just be bad for you in general and increase the risk of various inflammatory diseases. Also, there's evidence that part of the pathogenesis of MS may be due to dysfunction of the blood-brain barrier, the normal barrier between the blood and the central nervous system that keeps the immune system out. And part of that barrier is the parasites. And these parasites, these cells in the brain that form part of the blood-brain barrier, actually express GLP-1 and SGLT2. And so there's a possibility that these drugs somehow improve the function of the blood-brain barrier. Also, some of these drugs, for instance, liraglutide, which is a GLP-1 blocker, Victoza, Saxenda, in animal studies, it increases an antioxidant enzyme, superoxide dismutase, in the mitochondria. And oxidative damage may also be part of the pathogenesis of MS. Also, the same drug, liraglutide, may have a potential remyelinating effect. Again, only in animal studies, there's evidence that the oligodendrocyte precursor cells, the cells that can turn into oligodendrocytes, which are the cells that form myelin in the central nervous system, may be activated by this drug. Also, the other class of medications, SGLT2, also has antioxidant properties and may reduce microglia. These are part of the innate immune system within the central nervous system that may not initiate multiple sclerosis, but may be part of smoldering multiple sclerosis, the low-grade inflammation causing progressive MS within old lesions. There is a little bit of animal data on these drugs. For instance, this is a study done on dulaglutide, Trulicity, in EAE. This is experimental autoimmune encephalomyelitis. This is a mouse model of multiple sclerosis. They used a technique called MOG-EAE. And here you can see the x-axis is time, and they induce the disease and then wait to see how disabled the mice become. And on the y-axis is the clinical score, and a higher score means worse, more disabled. And the circles are the vehicle or the placebo, and they did the worst. They had the most disability. In the middle, the triangles are the semi-therapeutic dose, meaning they received dulaglutide, but later, after the disease was already initiated. And those who did the best, the diamonds, are those who received the prophylactic dose of dulaglutide. They got the treatment prior to the initiation of EAE, and they had the least disability. They did still have some disability, but did much better than placebo. But who cares about mice? Let's take a look at actual humans with MS in the study. Now, this is a bird's eye view, very difficult to interpret, but let's take a look at the raw data. For instance, liraglutide, you can see there were only 12 instances of multiple sclerosis out of nearly 30,000 total cases, and that's around 1 in 2,500. The actual prevalence of MS in the United States is around 1 in 350 to 1 in 500, so this does seem very low, and compare that to some of these other weight loss drugs like phentermine, 10 cases out of 4,700, 1 in 470 risk, that looks more more like the background rate of multiple sclerosis, so it definitely looks like something is going on here. It's much easier to interpret the data like this. These are the odds ratio. This vertical line is an odds ratio of 1, meaning the risk in people getting the drug is the same as expected in the general population. You can see for a lot of these other weight loss drugs, they're kind of centered around 1. Maybe there's a little bit of a lower risk in people taking naltrexone, slightly higher risk in people taking Wellbutrin, Topamax, and amphetamines, but kind of overall centered around an odds ratio of 1. But look at these classes of weight loss drugs. So these are the GLP-1 agonists. This is the SGLT2 inhibitor that they studied, Jardiance, and this is metformin, an old type 2 diabetes drug. So semaglutide, brand names Ozempic, Wegovy, the odds ratio was 0.238. In other words, a 76% lower risk of multiple sclerosis than expected. For Trulicity, odds ratio of 0.165, roughly 85% lower risk. For liraglutide, Victoza, Saxenda, an 84% lower risk. And for Jardiance, this is the SGLT2 inhibitor they looked at, an odds ratio of 0.234, a 77% lower risk. And even metformin, not quite as strong of an effect, odds ratio of 0.39 or 61% reduced risk. And what's most striking is the difference between the different classes of weight loss drugs. Now, as you probably can tell, I'm highly skeptical of the results of this study for various reasons. One reason is it's just too good to be true. Let's say that taking a single dose of Ozempic is 100% effective of you ever developing multiple sclerosis for the rest of your life. As implausible as that may sound, it still wouldn't really explain the data. And the reason is the mean age of onset of multiple sclerosis is 30. And a lot of people aren't really taking these drugs at age 18. The risk of type 2 diabetes and obesity increases with age. Now, they don't say in the article what the average age of treatment is, but I suspect that it's fairly close to 30. So if you take the drug at age 30, even if it's 100% effective, it can only reduce your lifetime risk of multiple sclerosis by 50%. And there's a lot of evidence that the onset of MS, the pathophysiologic onset of MS, is long, often years or even decades prior to the first symptom. There's a lot of evidence for this. I won't get into it. So I think it's not really plausible these drugs could cause an 85% causal risk of multiple sclerosis. Another thing is you can't really infer the rate of multiple sclerosis in people taking these drugs from these data because it's not a real population study. It's just voluntary reporting. I think maybe what's going on here is there's some bias in what types of side effects people tend to report. Like Ozempic is well known to cause gastrointestinal side effects, pancreatitis, malnutrition in some cases, things like that. And people are going to report those side effects. Whereas even if people get multiple sclerosis, they may not associate it with Ozempic and they may be less likely to report it. Whereas if someone took a vaccine and shortly after got symptoms of MS, they may be much more likely to associate the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis with that vaccine and be more likely to report it. There's definitely a cognitive bias here. Another thing is, even if these drugs do prevent you getting multiple sclerosis, does that mean they treat multiple sclerosis? Not necessarily. I mean, these are two different things. There's a lot of evidence that Epstein-Barr virus is part of the causal pathway of MS, but a recent drug trial, ATA-188, did not show any benefit in the treatment of multiple sclerosis. This is an anti-Epstein-Barr virus immunotherapy. I don't know if it's that specific drug, but it may be that once Epstein-Barr virus turns on your immune system, it's too late. You need a different sort of treatment. The same may be true with the fat cells and the pro-inflammatory cytokines, and may be involved in the initiation of multiple sclerosis, but not necessarily the prognosis of the disease. The other thing is there are a lot of questions about the long-term safety of these drugs, and of course, this is true for weight loss and type 2 diabetes too. Even if these drugs work, are you going to take them forever? Are you going to take them for 30 years? The risk may be much greater than in these short-term 1 to 2 year clinical trials, and it's really hard to know the long-term risks for certain. And now, I do think there could be something here. This is interesting preliminary data. It's certainly interesting that there's a big difference between different classes of weight loss drugs, and it warrants further research. And there is some ongoing research. This is a randomized trial for metformin versus placebo in progressive MS in Belgium, 120 participants. We'll see what the results show. I'd be interested to see a randomized trial for Ozempic or a similar drug, but it doesn't exist yet. There is some small observational data suggesting these drugs are safe in people with multiple sclerosis. They don't exacerbate the disease, at least in small observational studies, though there's no evidence they're beneficial in either observational or randomized trials. And I'd be interested to know, post in the comments, have you taken any of these drugs, Ozempic, Jardiance, or any of the other drugs in these classes, or metformin, and how did it affect your weight, your type 2 diabetes, if you have those conditions, and your multiple sclerosis, and did you experience any side effects? And as always, let me know if you have ideas for other videos.